Another group process that I want to talk about today is the process of de-individuation, and that's when a person begins to lose their individual identity and their own sense of self when they are a part of a particular group. There's two things that often happen um, for this process to take hold. One is arousal, so persons need to have a certain sense of arousal, which as we've already talked about, there is just kind of a general and maybe even intuitive or innate sense of arousal that occurs when people are in groups. And then two, when that is combined with a diffused sense of, uh, of a responsibility. When these two things come together, people may commit certain acts and do things that they wouldn't normally do. And this occurs because of a lessening of certain kinds of restraints, more impulsivity that can lead to different kinds of self gratification, and this can also lead to destructive social relations and group processes that can lead to either violence or destructiveness. So, the general a definition of de-individuation is a loss of self-awareness and a loss of evaluation apprehension. Tends to occur in group situations that foster responsiveness to group norms, and this can either be for good or for ill. Um, Probably the one of the basic or most well-known examples of this kind of phenomena, more of a negative form of this phenomena, would be looting. And so there's been several instances throughout history of when groups get together and when certain social norms begin to fall, persons will begin to loot. So they'll begin to steal things, commit various acts of vandalism, including destruction of property, as well as acting out violently towards others. And this idea comes from or stems from this the fact that there's a loss of the idea of the individual and certain commitments that individuals may have to certain values. So, one of the big factors for de-individuation is how large the group is. So, the larger the group, the more its members lose self-awareness and become willing to commit atrocities. So, the larger the group you have, the more the sense of a shared responsibility and almost kind of an acquiescence of an individual responsibility to the group and simply following whatever current group norms are happening. So the larger the group gets, it can foster this sense of not feeling responsible and thus feeling more bold or less concerned about doing things that they normally wouldn't do. People's attention is focused on the situation, not on themselves. There's an idea in these kinds of situations where people get caught up in the experience. There's more of an everybody's doing it attitude. So if I see several persons who might be looting or acting violently towards other persons, I may feel more open to do that or less constraint on my own individual behavior and more of a sense of wanting to join or just feeling like it was okay to join. So in these situations, person often attribute their behavior to the situations rather than their own choices. So that's that concept of de-individuation, a loss of the self that gets caught up in or absorbed within the group. So the idea, and then oftentimes later reporting, when people talk about what it is that actually happened, they'll report it in such a sense of, I was simply doing what everybody else was doing. That's what was actually going on at that point. So when persons feel a sense of anonymity in certain kinds of situations, it may actually lessen their own individual inhibitions, makes them less self-conscious, more kind of group conscious, so they're more kind of following what the group is dictating or what the group is doing, and more responsive to the cues present within the situation. It's this idea of when the situation is really in some ways kind of dominating what person's individual attitudes and behaviors are actually doing. And it's this idea of kind of the group takes over and there's a loss of self that occurs and kind of being sucked up into the group. This is one of the, in the more recent factors, as the internet has grown, this may be why people are so much more likely to say things or to do things online that they wouldn't do in normal life. Whether that's conversations on Twitter, or the way people will talk to each other like on Facebook or some other type of social media. Because of the anonymity and the way you can hide behind certain things online, some people seem to be more open to doing certain kinds of things, or especially treating others in ways that are often much more negative. For example, in things like internet bullying or those kinds of situations. So here's some data from a bunch of children who they did a study on that they looked at kind of like how often they would take candy and how much candy that they would actually take and how likely they were to do things when they're out on Halloween night that was more transgressive. And they found that when the people were in groups, they were much more likely to do things that were against kind of the social norms. And then even when they were identified, they were still likely to do those things when they were in a group. Whereas when they were alone, and especially when they were identified, they were much less likely to do that. So the alone group who were identified were much less likely to do something transgressive on a Halloween night, whereas the persons most likely to do something were people who were in groups and who were or non-identified. So when you arouse certain persons and when you distract their attention, even for a minor action, this increases the likelihood of aggressive outbursts by large groups. So when you have things like group shouting, chanting, clapping, dancing, these kinds of things can hype people up and reduce different kinds of self-consciousness. And we've seen this, for example, when a sports team will win some sort of championship, and when people will kind of go out into the streets. Sometimes when groups do this, it can lead to either violence or vandalism. And it's this idea of as the group gets larger and larger, there's more of a feeling of wanting to engage in these kinds of things. So when persons act this way and they tend to be more impulsive, and they tend to not think about their own values or what they would do on a normal basis, and they're instead kind of reacting to the immediate situation. Now, this doesn't mean that these kinds of behaviors are always negative. Oftentimes, we seek these type of de-individuation group experiences. So, for example, when you go to see your favorite sports team, that idea of getting caught up in what's happening during the game and those kinds of things doesn't always necessarily lead to violence, but people actually enjoy that feeling of connecting with other people who are supporting the same team and cheering for the home team. Same thing can also happen in churches. When people enter into worship experiences, a lot of times they report a feeling of kind of losing that sense of self. Group experiences can often diminish self-consciousness and tend to disconnect behavior from our own personal attitudes. However, the opposite of the de-individuation process would be something like self-awareness. And self-awareness is a self-conscious state in which attention focuses on the self and makes people much more sensitive to their own attitudes and dispositions. So self-awareness is the opposite of de-individuation. And what they found in several different research studies is those who are more self-aware tend to exhibit much more increased levels of self-control, and they're also much less likely to actually cheat. So circumstances that decrease self-awareness, such as when persons engage in alcohol use, tend to increase de-individuation, and de-individuation tends to decrease in circumstances that increase self-awareness. And so it's the same idea of when you're more aware of yourself, and maybe in some ways either more connected to yourself or more interested or thinking about your own values, your own thoughts, when you're thinking about the effects of your own behavior on other persons, that can increase your own self-awareness and actually also increase your own ability for self-control and your own ability to refrain from certain types of attitudes and actions. So our next section is going to be on this process of group polarization, group polarizations. And group polarization is when the functioning of the group tends to take away the ability for the group to think for themselves, or I should say, takes away the ability for individuals within the group to actually think for themselves and make more effective types of decisions. So group polarization in general is the group-produced enhancements of members' pre-existing tendencies. So it's the way in which a group can kind of form certain attitudes to stick towards where they started. And why that can be negative sometimes is when a group is trying to figure out what to do, if they don't investigate different possibilities, different opinions, different values, they can miss out on what the best possible decision may be. So group polarization in general strengthens the members' average tendencies and takes away from splitting within the group itself. Some of the early research on group polarization was done on what was known the risky shift phenomenon. And this is the idea that when the original research was done, starting in the 70s and 80s, group and individual decisions tended to be riskier after group of a discussion. And so the early research seemed to suggest that when persons were given an opportunity in a group to think about possible outcomes, they would tend to choose more of a riskier option. And this occurs not only when the group decided by a consensus, but after a brief discussion, individuals too would actually alter their own their particular decisions. Now, what they found later is in reality, this risky shift is not necessarily universal. Some dilemmas lead people to be more cautious after the discussion. So the idea was it's not necessarily that group polarization necessitates a movement towards a more risky decision. Instead, it's probably the case that group polarization kind of tends to lead you to where you already were, meaning it leads you to affirm your own predispositions and to go ahead and agree with those and to make your decision based on those. So in the original research that was done, the original risky shift dilemma was about this woman named Helen and whether she should spend time and energy on writing her novel. And what most people in that group tended to do was to say that she should go ahead and go for reading this novel, or I'm sorry, for writing this novel, and should go ahead and take the risks involved in trying to get her book actually published. And what they found is, in this situation, it's not really that risky for this woman to actually do it. So the group tended towards a more risky outcome because the stakes weren't that high. So they were willing to say, hey, she should go for it. She should try to write this novel. She should try to work on this novel. She should try to get it published because the stakes weren't that high. But when you change the dilemma, and in this case, the dilemma was involving a man who they named Roger. And when you change the circumstances that Roger is in, so Roger has a low-paying job, and he has 2 children, so he doesn't have a whole lot of money to actually risk. And they ask him, should he invest in a more risky stock? Most persons instead said, no, you shouldn't invest in that. And so what happened there is, because the situation itself was more risky, it caused persons to be much more cautious in terms of the decision that they're making. Whereas in the first example with Helen, because Helen didn't have a whole lot at stake, or at least the question didn't define her as having a whole lot of risky things at stake, persons gravitated towards that more risky type of decision. So discussion typically strengthens the average inclination of different group members. So it tends to take the initial inclination and to strengthen it, or make it, or to, in a sense, polarize that particular type of situation. So this is that same. So this is that same study going from 2 different types of groups. So group A that favored something tended to favor it more as they discussed it as a group. And then group B, they initially opposed something, and then they opposed it more after the discussion. So this is the idea of your starting point, which for each of these groups, group A was in favor of something, and group B was opposed to something. And what they found is, after they discussed the issue as a group, it polarized them, meaning it made group A much more in favor of it, and group B much less in favor of it. The same kinds of things can happen in terms of personal prejudice. And in these cases, something like group polarization doesn't necessarily increase prejudice. Instead, once again, it increases the current view or the current setup of the group. So in this case, we had 2 different groups of prejudiced persons. One had a high level of prejudice, and the second one had a much lower level of a prejudice. So what happened is, as the group began to discuss, the high prejudice groups actually increased in their prejudiceness, and the low prejudice groups actually decreased. So here again, group polarization isn't necessarily negative, but it depends on the starting point of the group as to where they will end up in terms of the overall group thought processes behind whatever decision it is that they're trying to make, or whatever values that they currently hold. The polarization effect can also occur just kind of in everyday life, and there's a lot of different examples of this. And how we notice this or see this in everyday life is where when people tend to associate more with others whose attitudes are actually much more similar to their own. So a lot of times in different types of communities, in terms of choosing where you will live, you will tend to move into either neighborhoods or communities that tend to share either your political or social or religious views. In politics, we tend to only talk with persons who share our same politics. And sometimes these particular communities can serve as echo chambers, meaning that we just simply hear the same thing over and over again from the people that we associate with. When we're on the internet, we tend to selectively expose ourselves to media that already endorses what our views and our values are, things that we already believe to be true. And this is especially true in terrorist organizations. And there's been a lot of really interesting research on this, the way in which terrorist organizations, when they recruit people in, they tend to keep them isolated from certain kinds of media. They only spend time with each other. They will often separate themselves from the larger society, and by kind of circling themselves and keeping them separated from others, they can increase that group polarization towards their own views on certain things. One of the things that we've seen, especially within the United States lately, is the group polarization that occurs within both Republicans and within Democrats. If you look over this a particular span from 1994 to 2017, you'll see that both Democrats and Republicans have a polarized towards their own particular viewpoint. So for Democrats have increasingly agreed that racial discrimination is the main reason why black people can't get ahead these days. Democrats have been much more likely to agree that that's the case, and then interestingly, Republicans have been less likely to agree that that's the case. So that there's been a split or a polarization on that view that becomes stronger and stronger over time. There's a few different ways that the group may be influencing each other, either informationally or normatively. Two ways that group polarization can kind of influence people. Informational influence is when something about the information that is presented is accepted as a reality about that particular situation. So this is the senses in which the arguments that a group gives matter and are taken very seriously. And then active participation within the group actually produces more of the attitude change, meaning it increases those attitudes that are associated with where the group already thinks it is. So this is the way in which the simple presentation of information and an argument within a group can actually influence people. Now, the second way that groups can influence people is normatively. And normative influence is based on the person's desire to be accepted or admired by the other people in the groups. And so in some ways, this is the more of the social influence that a group can have on a person's perceptions, attitudes, or actions. Social comparison is is our tendency to evaluate our own opinions and abilities by actually comparing ourselves with other persons. So we use that as a way to kind of justify or think about the things that we're doing. And then pluralistic ignorance is also plays a role, and this is the false impression of what most other people are thinking or feeling, or how they are responding. So it's the way in which we can often misevaluate what other people are thinking, and oftentimes overestimate how close their opinions are to our own. It's in some ways similar to a type of self-serving bias, because it's the ways in which we assume more people are thinking about things the way that we're thinking about them, and they have that same belief or value with the same level of a confidence that we have. To what we were discussing before, and that's this idea of when we are merely exposed to the thoughts of others, when we're exposed to what their judgments are on certain sorts of things, it will actually increase us in terms of being more conscious. In terms of being more cautious, as in the case of Roger, or it will increase our riskiness, as we saw in the case of Helen. So one of the big questions about groups is how much do they hinder or how much do they assist in making good types of decisions? Meaning, what are the ways in which groups, one, how do groups influence us when we're making decisions in a collective sort of manner? And then two, how do they help us either positively or effectively make for better decisions? What are the kind of the qualities that lead to that? To those kinds of things. And this leads to what's been defined as groupthink, the way in which groups can kind of begin to move towards one particular decision, and groupthink can often negatively influence people in terms of the types of decisions that they make. So if we think about different work groups, people working on some kind of common problem or trying to come up with a particular solution, we can think of the cases where a team spirit is actually really good for morale and can boost productivity. And a shared group identity can often motivate people to persist on a project. But, however, sometimes when making decisions, close-knit groups may pay a real price. And this is where groupthink may actually come to play. There's several different times historically where this has happened. One is the invasion of a Pearl Harbor, when persons in charge did not pay special attention of the warning signs that a attack on Pearl Harbor was actually imminent. The Bay of Pigs invasion, where President Kennedy tried to send a military coup to occur within the country of Cuba, and it failed miserably. Or finally, the Vietnam War. Each of these cases are really more political types of decision making that what social psychologists have found led to certain kinds of problems of groupthink and led to these decisions being basically ineffective and not very helpful overall. So, decision-making groups can sometimes have a tendency to suppress dissent in the interest of a group harmony. And this became defined as this process of groupthink. And the original research into these different kinds of decision-making bodies was done by Janus in 1971. And he defined groupthink as the mode of thinking that persons engage in when concurrent seeking becomes so dominant in a cohesive in-group that it tends to override realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. And Janus pointed out there's three characteristics of these groups. They tend to be more amiable and cohesive, meaning they tend to be more friend-based and cohesive. There was a relative isolation of the group from dissenting viewpoints. And there was a directive leader who signaled which decision he or she favors. So those were the 3 points. Overall cohesiveness of the group, isolation of the group from others, and a directive leader who signaled what kinds of answers he or she actually wanted. So Janus identified 8 different symptoms that occur within this process of groupthink. The first kind of one, or the first kind of general category, was that these groups tend to overestimate their group's might and their group's right, meaning that these groups tended to perceive themselves as invulnerable and not really feeling like this is going to be a challenge or that they have anything really to lose. And there was an unquestioned belief in the group's morality, meaning they believed that their moral values and judgments were true, and the way that they were going about the problem was morally justified. Second, the second kind of group of categories was being overly closed-minded. There was a significant amount of a rationalization that occurred within the group, and they tended to stereotype their opponent, meaning the persons that they were arguing against or had different views of them. They tended to stereotype them and believe things about them that may or may not have actually been true. Finally, the group suffers towards pressures towards uniformity. There was a conformity pressure, meaning that people felt like they needed to all agree on the same course of action or the same set of facts. Persons would self-censor, meaning rather than presenting a dissenting viewpoint or opinion, they would censor themselves if they could tell that the group was already believing something to be true. There was a illusion of unanimity, meaning that everybody believed that everybody was agreeing the same way on a particular thing. Persons thought that they all were in agreement on a certain thing, even though behind the scenes or within their own minds they were not there. And then finally, mind guards. And mind guards are the ways in which a leader is protected from certain kinds of information that would call into question the current thing that is believed to be true, or the morality of the group's decisions themselves. So these 8 things are what Janus identified as the processes that lead to groupthink. Now, there's several areas of research that seem to support Janus's initial theory about groupthink. Different research that's been conducted since this development has shown that a directive leadership is often associated with a poor decision-making. Groups tend to prefer supporting information over challenging information, meaning that groups tend to pick out or find things that support what they already believe to be true, rather than information that might challenge their own view. When people are in people who are in a group tend to look for acceptance and approval and to find their social identity found in the group, and because of that, they may suppress certain kinds of disagreeable thoughts. So it's a way in which, when you're in a particular group and that group means a lot to you, and the identity that you formed as being a part of the group, you can suppress your need to actually speak out against certain parts of the group. Groups that make smart decisions tend to have widely distributed types of conversations and are socially attuned to members who take turns speaking. So this is the idea that a good group is one that actually invites different kinds of perspectives and different kinds of conversations to occur. And often these groups are set up in such a way that each person has a turn to say something. Each person has a chance to try to contribute to the group itself. Other research has shown that groups with diverse perspectives tend to outperform groups of like-minded experts, and that group success often depends both on what the group members know and also how effectively they can share that particular information. Now, it's not always the case that friendships need to breed groupthink. Groupthink can come about because of persons wanting to feel connected to the group and not wanting to disrupt the group process. But if you can form friendships that are based on both mutual affirmation as well as the ability to question and critique others, it can actually enhance those. It can actually enhance those sorts of things. So in a secure, highly cohesive group, committed members will often care enough to voice a disagreement. So for example, there's a lot of times, especially like in academic circles, where you look for friends or you look for colleagues who are actually willing to critique your group, because you know that in the long run, that critique that occurs is actually going to be in your best interest. And the more critique you can get will actually help to hone and strengthen your argument rather than actually take it away. So in that sense, you can develop groups that have certain types of a normative influence that, rather than favoring consensus, the normative influence can actually favor critical analysis. Offers a few recommendations to kind of counter groupthink. One is to try to be more impartial, so not to try to favor certain ideas or certain values or those kinds of things, but to try to take things on much more objectively. To actually be a part of a group that encourages critical evaluation and encourages each other to actually ask questions and to critique each other. Sometimes it's helpful to actually subdivide the group. And so kind of split off into smaller groups that can discuss the issue more kind of clearly and independently of each other, and then come back together and to air their differences or air the places where they disagree on certain things. It's also helpful to welcome critiques from people outside of the group. So people that you respect or know, you can have them come in and actually take a look at the kinds of decisions that you're making and offer counter suggestions or other evidence that maybe you hadn't thought of. And then finally, sometimes before you make a final decision on something, go ahead and do one more meeting to air out any types of lingering doubts you have or things that you aren't so sure about. Now, just because there are times when groupthink can occur, it doesn't mean that every group decision is ultimately flawed. There's many cases or many times when two heads are going to be better than one, when groups can actually facilitate effective group decision making and actually help in terms of figuring out what it is that they want to do. Some ways you can enhance group brainstorming is by combining group and solitary brainstorming, meaning that you can sometimes separate people out, have them do some brainstorming on their own, and then bring them back together to do that same type of process within a group. You can have people interact through writing. So sometimes it's actually helpful to write down your ideas and share them in written form. And have people read through them, and that can take away from some of the social influences that might disrupt the ability to critically evaluate. And this, of course, would be the same thing with something like electronic forms of brainstorming, meaning so you could do it through like an online discussion or an online forum or platform where people can respond to the written thoughts and feelings of other people. There are also times when an individual can actually have an influence on the group to where the group norms or group influence doesn't necessarily override when an individual is trying to contribute to that group. There are a couple things that are important for the minority to do, or a minority opinion to do, and for it to work or for it to be effective within a group, it's helpful to be more consistent. So it's much more influential when the minority doesn't waver in terms of its position. One of the difficulties of being within the minority is based on the minority slowness effect, and this is the tendency for people with minority views to be much more slower in terms of expressing their own differences. And this is the same kind of way in which the group influence can kind of take away from or make it harder for an individual to actually express their views. It's also important for a minority view or group to be consistent and persistent with the way in which they're trying to present their views. So the more self-confidence they can have, it will tend to raise doubts within the larger majority and the leaders that are there, and then may influence the types of decisions that the group is making as well. And then finally, the lone defector from the majority tends to be even more persuasive than a consistent minority voice, meaning that when someone can really defect and really be that voice that's very different, it kind of stands out among all the others and can influence the overall decisions that they're going to make. Now, when we think about this minority influence in terms of leaders, leaders can have different kinds of effects based on the type of group that they're in. And leadership can really come in different types of forms. So task leadership are leaders who are really good at organizing work, setting standards, and trying to focus on goals. So persons who are good at this kind of research tend to be more kind of singly focused and are really trying to get something done. and know how to set benchmarks and find different ways to motivate people to try to get whatever the task is at hand and to get it done as soon as possible. Social leadership is a little bit different from task leadership because it's more about building teamwork, mediating conflict, and offering support for people within the group. So social leadership is much more about paying attention to the social dynamics that are occurring within the group and trying to either mitigate different kinds of conflicts or finding ways to support people and move them towards the ultimate goal. Finally, transformational leadership is leadership that's enabled by one's vision, inspiration, and the way in which they can exert a significant influence. So transformational leadership is probably much more related to spiritual leadership, or people like Martin Luther King Jr., or Gandhi, people who were both eloquent in terms of their speech, but also very inspirational in terms of their actions and helped lead large groups towards a common goal.